All right. Our worship theme this month is many gods, one God, or no God. And we're exploring different ideas about God and different ways of encountering God. This Sunday, we're exploring the many gods side of the equation, so polytheistic religions or religious traditions which honor multiple representations of deity. And it was actually difficult to find UU worship materials that honor or celebrate a polytheistic worldview. And that's because our tradition strongly emphasizes the unity of existence. It's in the name, Unitarian, right? So one God, one reality, one source from which we all come. Or as there's an old joke that goes that Unitarians believe in, at most, one God. But that is an old joke, and it hasn't been true for a long time. And today, Unitarian Universalists have a wider variety of viewpoints on what the divine might look like and how we might encounter it. And our faith community is much richer for their contribution to our tradition. So I'm going to start in kind of an offbeat way with a poem by Mary Oliver, who is not a polytheist as far as I know. And the poem is called The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Who made the world? Who made the world is a religious question that confronts all of us. If not precisely as who made the world, then what made the world or what makes the world? Where does all of this living diversity, this glorious diversity, the grasshopper, the swan, the black bear come from? Well, last Sunday was Evolution Sunday weekend, and we honored the theory of evolution because we do, in fact, know where that glorious diversity comes from. We know that from science. It's a process of change and variation and selection that unfolds over billions of years here on our earth anyway. And I suspect that nature lover Mary Oliver, writing in the late 20th century, is well aware of this. But her poem isn't asking a scientific question, it's asking a religious question, which is, how do we properly encounter the vast creative energies and possibilities of life? With what kind of mental and emotional and spiritual orientation? And then how do we encounter being in self, the fact that there is, the suchness of life? What grounds and sustains this glorious suchness of the universe and the world and our own self? And how are we called to respond? Well, the Western religious, philosophical, scientific tradition is to look for one ultimate explanation to this question of where does it all come from and what is it all made of? One creator, one substance, one unified theory of physics. Unitarian Universalism, as I mentioned, comes out of that tradition. But this is an intellectual construct. The universe doesn't present itself to us as a unified anything. The universe presents itself to us in a vast multiplicity of forms, what William James called a blooming, buzzing confusion. And it is our human instinct to try to peel this back and look for some kind of unifying something behind it. And this human instinct is ancient. The early Greek philosophers speculated that everything that existed was really just like one thing if you really got down to it. Thales said this is water. Everything is made out of water. Heraclitus said everything is made out of fire. They were both totally wrong. But they were attempting a physical explanation of the universe, which for the time was a huge leap forward in the scientific imagination. And then a little bit later, Democritus postulated that everything is made up of atoms. These little tiny particles that whiz through empty space like billiard balls, too small to be seen, but they make up everything. And that is not a bad guess for someone who was living in the year 400 BC. And 2,400 years later, science seemed to confirm this tantalizing idea that underneath all of the different things in the world, there's just this one simple thing. We're all made of atoms. How neat, how tidy, how intellectually satisfying. But then it turns out that atoms break up into still smaller things, right? Protons, neutrons, electrons. And those break up into like 8 different varieties of quarks. And when you smash them together, this whole like zoo of elementary particles starts spilling out, like muons and gluons and tau particles and positrons and all this stuff. Right? The universe resists being reduced to one simple thing. So in every religious tradition, we are cautioned against hubris of thinking that our finite minds can too easily comprehend infinite reality. In the very first lines of the Tao Te Ching, we read that the name that can be named is not the eternal name. The way that can be told is not the eternal way. In Judaism, there's a prohibition against saying or writing the name of God. So you often see God written as like G-D in texts. Because to name God is to limit God, and God is that which is limitless. And in Islam, we have the same prohibition against making images of God. And then in Hinduism, there is a path to understanding what they would call Brahman, or sort of ultimate reality, being behind being. And this path is called neti, meaning not this, not this. And what you do is you remove all of the things that Brahman is not, and with whatever you are left with, that must be ultimate reality. So Brahman is not body. Brahman is not nameable. Brahman is not thought, and so on. In the Christian tradition, this is called via negativa. You say everything that God is not, crossing them all out, and in this way you approach what God is. And in Hinduism, this is called nirguna Brahman, God or ultimate reality without attributes, being itself. And these traditions recognize, or they're trying to honor the fact that the source of all being, or the source of all possibility, whatever is worthy of the name of God, necessarily defies human understanding. God, because God is so vast, resists all attempts to define or limit God. And however we conceive of God, that very conception constitutes a limit, and so is incomplete. And the danger that we are cautioned against is when we mistake our own conception of God for God. And the entire history of religion shows that this is a danger that human beings are constantly falling into again and again. As the saying goes, if you find that God hates all of the same people that you hate, something has gone very wrong with your conception of God. Or think of the way in the West God has been imagined with this patriarchal male figure as father, as king, and so on, using this gender language, right? So there's this conception of God as a he, which excludes the feminine from the space of the sacred and reinforces a patriarchal social order. And I think it's safe to say that the ultimate reality, the being behind all being, if such exists, does not have a gender. God is not a dude. But we're left with this language which shapes our perceptions and our thoughts. So the via negativa, the not this approach to spirituality is there to discourage us from bundling together a parcel of our own misunderstandings and prejudices and calling that package God. But you are also left with a very austere and intellectual conception of God if you go about it this way. And there are very few saints of different religious traditions who claim that through this path they have had an ecstatic union with the divine, an ecstatic return to being itself. But everyone else is kind of left with something that's hard to hold on to. What, in the end, lies behind everything? Well, not this, not this. What is the meaning of it all? Not this and not this. And what do I turn to when times are hard? Well, not this, not this. Different religious traditions deal with this unsatisfactoriness in different ways. Right, we started the month talking about the humanist path of no God, which does not personalize ultimate reality in any way, which does not put us in a relationship with whatever lies behind the curtain of the universe, if indeed there is anything behind that curtain. Instead, it puts it squarely on us human beings to make meaning for ourselves and to care for one another. And many Unitarian Universalists fall within this tradition, which in our context is a religious tradition. Some may think of it as a philosophical tradition. A different approach contained within many religious traditions, which we are concerned with today, is to go in completely the opposite direction. It is the path of many gods. So we can refuse to name the infinite because it is infinite and we don't want to limit it. Or we can take that very creative vastness of the infinite as permission to give it infinite names. Or at least really just a lot of names, if you're familiar with these traditions. Right? In Hinduism, this is called Brahman Saguna, God with attributes. God understood through God's own creative manifestations. And so these are nameable. We have the trinity of Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the sustainer, and Shiva, the destroyer. There's Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity, and Ganesha, the god of thresholds. And on and on and on. Just an enormous panoply of gods. In Buddhism, we think of Buddhism in the West as being this kind of very austere, intellectual, I'm meditating, I'm being mindful kind of tradition. But Mahayana Buddhism, which is most Buddhists, is actually a very different tradition, which has this enormous cosmology of divine beings and heavenly beings and beings from other dimensions that come down to earth and help us. And we reach out to them and they ease our path to enlightenment. And then within Catholicism, we have the many, many intercessionary saints, and of course, Mother Mary. And I'm stretching this a little. These are not gods, but they fill the same role, right? They bridge the gap between our humanness and the vastness of the divine. And I want to note here that this many gods approach to thinking about spirituality is often a way of reintroducing the feminine into our images of what is the divine. It's one of the great strengths and richnesses of that tradition, that there are so many ways of thinking about that which is sacred, that the feminine is fully brought into the picture and honored, and that energy is accessed. So these gods and these goddesses, these saints and bodhisattvas, they are not indescribable. They are vividly imagined and depicted in all these ways that are instantly recognizable to their worshipers. You know, there's Ganesha with his elephant head and he's riding a mouse. There's, I can't pronounce this, but Avalokiteshvara. Sorry, I struggle with that every time. Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of infinite compassion and is pictured with 1,000 arms to reach out to people, to provide them with everything that they need. So these are instantly recognizable to the people that love them. They're not unknowable. Their exploits are told in many, many stories. They're not inscrutable. They have human passions and human foibles. And they're not unrelatable, because the whole point of conceiving of deity in this way is to create a gateway of relation. In Hinduism, this is called bhakti yoga, the path of devotion. And spirituality is understood as a personal, adoring relationship to one or a handful of gods. And we see this within a lot of polytheistic religions, that because there are so many gods, and because they're so specific in their attributes, you form a relationship with the God that particularly resonates with you and that meets your needs. You honor all of the gods, but you might have a very intimate relationship with one or just a handful. In the ancient pagan world, you would have your household gods and maybe the god of your city or the god of your profession. Unitarian Universalists today who are pagan might have a particular divinity that they have adopted as a patron. You recognize the larger spiritual forces, but you're particularly devoted to one or two. And the path of devotion, because it embraces particularity, is often very sensory or even sensual in its worship. The gods in worship are represented in many different ways, probably with a really vivid image, maybe some objects that represent their attributes. There's often an altar in the home, a space that is delineated and set aside for that divinity's presence. And that altar is decorated with flowers, gifts, candles, offerings of food or drink. The point of the offerings is to treat the deity just as you would treat an honored guest in your home, as a sign of welcome and gratitude. And this is a very embodied form of worship. You don't just think your devotion out to the universe, but you show that devotion the way you would to any beloved, with gifts, with acts of kindness, with tokens of recognition. Bhakti Yoga has a very long tradition in India. It emerged around 600 AD. And over the course of its history, there have been many poet saints. These are writers who have captured the popular imagination with the intensity of their devotion to a particular god or goddess, and they express this in verse. And this devotion is sometimes expressed in such personal terms of desire or longing that it could almost be read as traditional love poetry. There's the poet Saint Mirabai was a 16th century Indian woman, a princess. She forswore earthly marriage because her heart belonged to Krishna. That was scandalous. She left the palace to live life as a wandering guru. That was way scandalous. And she wrote these poems about her love for her god, Krishna. And one of them, she writes, "He left his fingerprint on a glass that the earth drinks from. Every religion has studied it. Churches and temples use the geometry of those lines to establish rites and laws and prayers and our ideas of the universe. I guess there is just no telling how out of hand and wonderfully wild things will get when our lips catch up to his." So this is a different tradition of worship than is often associated with Unitarianism. I don't know that William Ellery Channing ever preached about catching up to God's lips, or used the phrase wonderfully wild in one of his sermons. But maybe we're the worst for it. Maybe he ought to have. Because regardless of our theological beliefs, the many gods path of devotion has strengths that we would do well to learn and incorporate into our own spiritual lives. There is the embrace of particularity, right? The delighting in the unique and varied expressions of being as we encounter them in the world, rather than removing ourselves intellectually, rather than letting abstractions come between us. We delight in divinity as it presents itself to us right in this moment. And we can get caught up in those abstractions. Have you ever encountered someone who claims to love humanity, but they clearly cannot stand people? Right? Embrace the particularity of your love in the people that are around you and the life that is around you. There's the playfulness and imagination and colorfulness with which religious ideas are explored in these traditions. Because the infinite is so vast and so creative, they're not afraid to be creative in return in how we reach out with our hearts and minds to this energy, right? And you can go nuts with the art of it and the music of it and dance and all of these different expressions. So pagan or polytheistic worship tends to be very multi-sensoried and embodied. And then it's very difficult to stand at a distance, right? Because your whole self is engaged. And finally, the bhakti tradition invites us through that path of devotion to find the modality through which we as individuals most intimately experience and express our love and our gratitude for life. To find our patron, as it were, and to honor that with our devotion. To find that thing through which we most intimately express and experience love, and to honor it with our devotion. So this could be music, could be the modality through which you most deeply touch the creativity of the world. But it could be gardening, or it could be working with children, or it could be mathematics, or caring for animals, or it could be your relationship with God or goddess or spirit. Whatever it is that connects you to life's creative energy in a way that feels nurturing and loving and sustaining to you and that loves the world back. This tradition says, take that seriously. Create a space for it in your home. Gift it with that which you care about. Honor it and practice devotion to that thing which makes you come alive with love and spills love back over into the world. So I want to close today with the same poem that we began with. And as I read it, listen for the threads of particularity and imagination and devotion in Mary Oliver's expression. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who was eating sugar out of my hand, who was moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who was gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Blessed be, and amen.